Welcome everyone to another engaging session in the Working Group 1 Theory seminar series of the Cost Action of the K-Peritia. Dina and I are delighted to have you with us today for a crucial discussion on the cultural expertise in the Middle East delivered by Dina Hadad herself.
Absolutely, Blazej. Thank you very much. Our collective exploration of cultural expertise has underscored its significance across different regions. And today's seminar brings a unique and essential perspective. The Middle East presents distinct conceptual and contextual challenges that shape how cultural expertise is understood and applied.
That's right. This session explores the region's rich linguistic and cultural dimensions, which not only define its specific practices of cultural expertise, but also contribute to the broader theoretical frameworks that is indeed promising to extend within the work of the working group. By critically engaging with these rich regional aspects and practices, we can better grasp how cultural expertise functions in legal, political, and social contexts in the Middle East.
Of course, one of the key aspects discussed is how cultural expertise navigates issues of translation and cross-border mobilities when applied in legal and policy settings. The Middle East, with its historical complexities and diverse social fabrics, offers a compelling case for examining the interplay between expertise, laws, and cultural knowledge.
Exactly. This seminar encourages us to reflect on how cultural expertise can move towards praxis in the region, considering both its opportunities and challenges. We look forward to sharing a dynamic discussion that broadens our understanding and sparks new research collaborations.
Thank you all for joining us today. We are excited to share our theoretical pursuits with you. So without further ado, let's dive into our discussion on cultural expertise in the Middle East. My presentation is going to provide some sort of reflections over conceptualization of the concept of cultural expertise within the context of the Middle East. And I'm going to approach that within three main examples that I have selected during my work, my research, and to elaborate on a number of other issues related to difficulty of conceptualization regarding the essential sort of theoretical framework and other aspects of implications. For that purpose, I have divided actually my seminar into a number of stages. The first stage is going to introduce my understanding or the stepping point with regard to what do we mean by cultural expertise and how does this really relate to the issue discussed within the area. Then I will elaborate a little bit more on the local context. I will read then cultural expertise within the context of the Arab Middle East, and look into three examples. One example of the three examples actually reflecting on normative legislative changes within the context of cultural expertise or the application of the cultural expertise. And thus we're talking about legalizing of cannabis in Lebanon, normative development, women rights in Syria, and some sort of eradication of specific penal code provisions within the context of United Arab Emirates. I'll end my presentation with some concluding remarks with regard to the application of the concept. The use of cultural knowledge is nothing novel actually in the study of law and other fields of humanities and social science. While social scientists involved in different sorts of activities and interpretations relating to cultural tools and knowledge, this was not visible until the theoretical framework of cultural expertise was introduced by Professor Holden in 2011. And what do we mean exactly by that? We mean the special knowledge that enables socio-legal scholars, or more generally speaking, cultural mediators, the so-called cultural brokers, to locate and describe relevant facts in the light of the particular backgrounds of the claimant and litigant and for the use of the court. Of course, while the definition seems to refer to the judicial context, a diverse ensemble of practices and instruments could be actually listed within the context of cultural expertise. This could really range from advisory roles in policymaking to expert witnesses, in cases involving indigenous people, members of diasporic communities, connection to migration, but also includes engagement with anthropologists and law practitioners, especially with regard to the interdependence and indivisibility of civil, political, economic, and social aspects of cultural rights and so on. This is in general the stepping stone for us to delve into the context of a particular reality like the Middle East. Epistemological choices actually in the Middle East remain in general similar to many others, limited and resentful to decolonization. The question of how and who could approve or create knowledge raises essentially the role of responsive critical methodology and pedagogy, since teaching, learning, and investigating go hand in hand in the pursuit of knowledge. In such multi-layered social reality, complex identities do actually flourish. It's quite common, or rather traditional, that in such a complex context that anthropologists call for decentralization of the law to make sure that such a specific relevant context is not missed. And so it remains discursively the reason behind the law role and the rationale. Thus, there was the need to read cultural expertise as a special knowledge that locates relevance and helps with the formation of rights and obligation within a legal framework that integrates culture and law at the legislative level. And this is particularly the focus of the examples I'm going to discuss further. It's going to be within normative context, within the legislative context, and it will further look into the possibility of applying this at the level of judicial. The reading of this knowledge within this particular reality makes it paramount to look beyond the speculative legal theory and examine the legal behavior within this practical, social, and historic framework. It's essential, however, while constructing the legal meaning, significance, or what we could call the truth, within its social process, to differentiate between cultural expertise as the tool to integrate law and culture defense. Although the latter is more commonly perceived when addressing culture and social practices and rationalities in the area, cultural expertise, however, is focusing on aspects of choices of law in normative development rather than seeking cultural justification. So there is no here attempt to seek any sort of cultural justification for application of laws. This is really an essential sort of disclaimer in the work, I suppose. Historically, the Arab world is often characterized as highly heterogeneous because it represents a diversity that encompasses a complex system of vertical loyalty and communal differentiation, ethnic, linguistic, sectarian, tribal, local, regional, and the like. While Islam, for example, is often assumed to be a major factor in the unity of the Arab culture, there are deep differences in the way it is understood and practiced in different parts of this area. The legacy, however, of the rule of law in the region has been perceived as legitimizing a structure characterized by sustained inequalities. The first post-colonial secular states actually were keen on homogeneous national identity. As such, this homogeneous rhetoric or orientation were translated into most constitutions of the Middle East post-colonial states. Against the backdrop of this shared reality across the region, I mean the complexity with the rule of law, both the history of colonization with its tendency to create nations that are forcefully brushed with one color and the consequent socio-legal aspects within which contemporary legal institutions, the legislative and the judicial, make it essential to articulate the need for cultural expertise in terms of availability, representation, and adjustment to each distinct nation within the area. So despite the fact that we refer to the area as a one sort of locality, reality is sublocalities, fluctuates in terms of applications, different sort of legal systems, and different sort of tendencies in terms of applications. The long-standing issue of unrealized rule of law affords substantial value to the role and impact of cultural expertise in realizing the legitimacy of available legal framework. While the practice remains invisible and less acknowledged, While this specific practice of the cultural expertise remains invisible and less acknowledged in courts due to its rigid and formalistic approach to expert witnesses, for example, in cultural issues, normative and legislative developments throughout the region do actually reveal a richer terrain of engagement with different representations of cultural expertise. These representations repeatedly call for the need to gain and use culture information that in turn can have an undeniable impact on the greater need for cultural expertise. Thus, the cases selected in my examples come from 3 different countries in the area: Lebanon, Syria, and the United Arab Emirates. While Syria and Lebanon, for example, share or have both been affected by constant conflict and economic fragility, the UAE is considered one of the richest countries in the region. The diversity of political and economic conditions has informed actually the need to conceptualize cultural expertise and identify experts in practices that are historically and culturally connected while sharing similar challenges to the rule of law and the state fragility. So we keep these challenges in mind, which are the triggers and the call for conceptualization of the cultural expertise. I'll start with my cases. The first case is talking about a specific sort of legal development took place in 2020, and that was the legalization of the cannabis cultivation in Lebanon. Of course, here we are talking about something very specific, and this reality reflects on a specific area within Lebanon in which the social fabric was extremely dependent on cultivating the cannabis, and for this specific reason, there was a lot of consequent involvement with the government due to the fact that it was completely delegalized and there was no acceptance to this sort of practice. However, the extent to which this sort of practice was really enshrined within this area made it even more taxing on the government to be able to follow in terms of criminalization of this practice. And due also additionally to the fact that the government was incapable in such a dire economic reality to provide any sort of alternatives. The compromise was really set several times in attempts before to legalize this sort of practice until it was really completely successful in April 2022. The draft, I suppose, was really submitted in February 2022 and approved on the 1st of April 2022. This made a huge sort of breakout of media reactions and so on due to the moral argument towards cultivation of cannabis. However, the argument of the social need and the dependency of farmers at the time made it almost impossible for the government to be able to step out of this reality without being in a shadow reality that would never really deny the de facto dependency of the people in this context. I think this case has important sort of implication in terms of the relevance of cultural expertise, the relation between the local culture, the lawmaking, and the functioning of the legal related mechanism. It shows that the efficacy of some established laws depends largely on their ability to accommodate local cultures and economic dependencies. In the context of lawmaking, cultural expertise then becomes a method and a technical tool of interpretation used by the court, or by an interpretation we mean this dissemination of culture sort of experts and so on, for the purpose of pursuing the achievement of the law and so on. I will move, this is really one single example that established for understanding, for normative interpretation of cultural expertise. Another example relates to the context in Syria. And in this context, I'm gonna really elaborate a bit on the reality of women's rights. Here we are dealing with a complete different situation. We're dealing with a constitution that borrows some aspects in terms of translation from French and Belgian constitutions. It does really advocate a secular sort of state that does not provide much of space for differences despite the heterogeneous reality in the country. And then we are talking also about a constitution that provides some sort of equality amongst all citizens, however, completely blind to the rights or to the overtly explicit rights of women, although there is no specific sort of legislation to spell out the fact that women are completely equal and so on. However, this is somehow the general sort of stand of the government. Major voids remain, despite this declared position of the state. Major voids remain in the context of application with regard to women's rights in relation to law of nationality, family law, labor law, and indemnity, and so on. The cases I'm dealing with as examples to configuring the relevance of cultural expertise in that context go into two parts. One part relates to some sort of aborted draft for the family law in Syria, and the other one relates actually to the continuous ongoing changes with regard to rights and law normative development after the start of the conflict in 2011. In the first part, I'm referring particularly to specific sort of a draft that was proposed by a group of more religiously oriented non-governmental organization to make some sort of changes to family law. The language of the draft was very problematic. This triggered mainly the reaction of women activists. So in 2009, this draft was proposed containing clear influence from conservative religious sort of a group and non-governmental institution. The draft had legal implications on matters that have dominated women groups in terms of curtailing women's rights, limiting their ability to seek further rights in marriage and inheritance and financial rights upon divorce. The language in the draft was unconventional since it used some sort of degrading terms for women as being subject to men's desires and other sort of elements of language that are not particularly even classic in the use of common language day to day. The draft was published to consult different social segments and seek opinion from non-governmental institutions. This by itself was under debate because this is not particularly usual practice. So this is something to take into account once discussing actually the process of making this law. However, women's rights activists were the first to be alerted and argued that the choice of language for legal purpose and the frame of rights cannot disregard changing historical and cultural context. Campaigns opposed the draft, argued for the obligation to frame the legal language of women's rights within contemporary context. This was motivated by the fear that courts would abide by the male legal formalists and formalism within which is completely discrimination against women. So that the idea is not particularly the language itself or standing on the language of law. The main issue is actually the application, because once we come to apply this language within the courts which are specialized with the family law, we're going to have the difficulty of interpreting this language, which doesn't even exist in the contemporary context of the social fabric. So ultimately, this draft was really aborted and did not really succeed in making any sort of changes due to the pressure the woman really put under this particular matter. I mean, I think that this is very significant in the context of having specific cultural expertise in the lawmaking process. Women as minorities within the other minorities, because as I said, Syria is really heterogeneous reality that includes a number of different sort of segments of groups with different backgrounds and so on, but rather women are really under a specific sort of law, and yet they rejected completely the application of a specific sort of terms and implementation within the court context. This specific sort of relevance to cultural expertise historically, despite the argument that there were different political orientations and purposes within the context of publishing this draft, seeking reactions from women and secular groups within the society, yet this is an enough sort of example to provide mounting social and parliamentary criticism eventually. And there was the decision against the proposed draft in general. The other aspect, which I think is very also important in the reading of cultural expertise in the context of Syria, is the ongoing changes after 2011. So despite the fact that we are living in a conflict sort of a reality, and there is this sort of dire economic situation, yet the government maintained specific sort of line in changing and developing all sorts of rules related to women's rights in the context of the law applied within the country. And of course, here there is absolutely no claim to say that Syrian women are only the women under the government sort of control. No, here this is only an analysis for this specific context, because I'm talking about this governmental sort of application. I think both cases in tandem are very, very separately and in tandem are very, very important, because they provide significant sort of relevance and characterization of multiplicit sort of application of laws, and the use of the cultural expertise as a tool to better understand legal sort of developments and normative development within the country. That's to that end the issue relevant to the case of Syria. I picked a third case actually in that context, which I found very interesting. And I think it's related more to state and identity identity building within the specific sort of legal context. And this is really the case in the United Arab Emirates. In 2020, there was actually new changes to the penal law. And these changes provided some sort of revolutionary alterations in the context of application of the country. I mean, for some it might not make a lot of difference, but in a reality where women are seeking a different sort of recognition for their own rights, that was very, very essential. So there was the eradication, the abolishing of the honor killing, femicide. I mean, we are talking about a specific sort of conservative community within which the application is very much driven by tribal and communal sort of understanding, despite the big number of expats and a multicultural sort of context that brings both together, yet there is some form of separation. And there was an understanding that conservative sort of lines need to be kept in that context. However, the law came to bring a big sort of change with the alteration of the application. And this, of course, I mean, you need to understand that a lot of similar cases might not even reach to the court when we are talking about femicide or honor killing. But yet the fact that it's not criminalized means the change of the set of evidence that could be used actually within the court. And this is a very essential element when we talk about applications and development of normative issues, in addition to tools within the judiciary and so on. I mean, there were some other also changes with regard to cohabitation and no need for having an official marriage and so on within the country. And that's particularly for establishing the country as a tourist destination and so on. And that's with regard to the federal law application. I think this is also an extremely important aspect, the standing example, how specific sort of cultural reality could really call the lawmaker to consider different sort of cultural application. And this is also a standing example to the relation between the society and the law of the society. Which one changes the other? Do we really, in socio-legal context, does the society changes the law or the law changes the society? Here we're talking about the law coming from specific sort of top place to apply in a way that could really bring differences in the understanding of the society. To what extent we are talking about two different societies here, the expats and the locals, and how could this really be separated? This is a question that could be actually under discussion and under further discussion. These were the three examples within which I tried to conceptualize the application of the cultural expertise in general, and I think if we look for communalities, one of the main starting points when we talk about the area is the unrealized rule of law. This is really a long-standing issue that brings all of these states together. And to what extent culture sort of changes could really bring different sort of legitimacy in the application of laws and understanding of rights, cultural rights in general sense. While, for example, the practice of cultural expertise remains invisible in the context of the Middle East, and the specific sort of formal system, I mean, what sort of legal system we're dealing with is a very important question, I suppose. And the fact that we are dealing with a very formalistic sort of system that does not accommodate this margin for expertise in general makes it harder to bring this to the court. However, this is really still a very persisting sort of matter, especially when we realize how much we could really read within the context of historical and cultural development of laws themselves, and how do they really have their own standing point in the context of making a just society that seeks always a transformation to reach to a better out of conflict or in a conflict resolution context.